Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I never thought much about rest stops until that night in October 2019. I was driving from Denver to Kansas City, taking the long route through rural Colorado and Kansas because I wanted to avoid the main highways. It was around 11:30 p.m. when my gas light came on, and I hadn't seen a station for the last 40 miles. The GPS on my phone showed a single dot ahead, a place called Murphy's Stop, about 12 miles down the road. I remember thinking it was probably one of those old family-owned places that barely stayed in business, but gas was gas, and I didn't have much choice. When I pulled into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. Not just quiet, dead silent. No traffic sounds, no wind, nothing. The station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Yellow fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting this sickly glow over everything. There were 2 other cars parked near the building, but I couldn't see anyone inside them. I pulled up to pump number 4 and got out. The air was cold, much colder than it should have been for October in Kansas. I could see my breath, which was strange because the weather app on my phone said it was 58 degrees. As I started pumping gas, I noticed the other 2 cars more clearly. Both had their windows down, but the interiors were completely dark. No dome lights, no phone screens, nothing. The pump was taking forever. Old pumps are slow, but this was ridiculous. It had been running for almost 10 minutes, and I was barely at half a tank. That's when I heard the first sound that wasn't the pump or the buzzing lights. It was coming from inside the station, a low humming, like someone was singing under their breath. I looked through the windows of the convenience store. The lights were on inside, but I couldn't see anyone behind the counter. There were aisles of snacks and drinks, all perfectly arranged, but no movement anywhere. The humming continued, and now I could tell it was definitely a human voice, though I couldn't make out any words. The pump finally clicked off. I screwed the gas cap back on and walked toward the station to pay. The automatic doors didn't open when I approached them. I stood there for a few seconds, waving my arms, but nothing happened. Then I noticed a small handwritten sign taped to the glass, "Push to enter." I pushed the door, and it opened with a loud creak that seemed to echo forever in the empty parking lot. Inside, the humming stopped immediately. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. I walked to the counter, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the linoleum floor. "Hello," I called out. No response. I waited for maybe 2 minutes, looking around for any sign of an employee. That's when I noticed the security monitors behind the counter. There were 6 screens showing different angles of the parking lot and interior. On one of them, I could see myself standing at the counter, but on another screen, the one showing the parking lot, I could see someone sitting in each of the 2 cars I'd noticed earlier. They were just sitting there, completely still, facing toward the station. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello, I need to pay for gas on pump 4. A door behind the counter opened, and an elderly man emerged. He looked normal enough. Gray hair, flannel shirt, probably in his 70s. But something was off about his movements. He walked too smoothly, like he was gliding rather than walking, and his eyes never blinked. Not once. "Pump 4, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "That'll be $47.50. I handed him my credit card, but he shook his head. "Cash only." I only had about $20 in cash, so I told him I'd have to use a card or I couldn't pay. He stared at me for what felt like a full minute, still not blinking. Then he smiled, and I saw that all of his teeth were perfectly white and perfectly straight, too perfect for someone his age. "That's fine," he said. "You can pay later." Before I could ask what he meant, He turned and walked back through the door behind the counter. I stood there, confused, holding my credit card. After another minute or two, I decided to just leave. I'd never been in a situation like this before, but I figured I could call the station later and pay over the phone. As I walked back to my car, I glanced at the two other vehicles. The people inside were still sitting there, motionless. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but something about their posture made me uncomfortable. They looked like they were waiting for something. I got in my car and started the engine. As I was backing out of the parking space, my headlights swept across the front of the station. That's when I saw him. The old man was standing at the window, watching me leave. But he wasn't behind the counter anymore. He was standing in the main area of the store, right up against the glass, and he was still smiling that perfect smile. I drove away as fast as I could without speeding. In my rearview mirror, I could see the station getting smaller and smaller, but the old man never moved from the window. Even when the building was just a tiny dot of light behind me, I could swear I could still see him standing there. About an hour later, I stopped at a well-lit truck stop to get coffee and calm down. I decided to look up Murphy's stop online, just out of curiosity. I searched for gas stations in that area, used Google Maps, even tried searching for the specific name. Nothing came up. According to every website I checked, there was no gas station at that location. The closest one was 30 miles in either direction. I told myself maybe the place was too small or too new to show up online. But the next day, I called the local sheriff's office in that county just to ask about it. The dispatcher was friendly enough, but when I described the location, she got quiet. "Sir," she said, "there hasn't been a gas station at that mile marker for over 15 years. The last one there was demolished after the owner died." I asked when the owner had died. She put me on hold for a few minutes, then came back. "Says here it was October 2004. Elderly gentleman named Murphy. The station was called Murphy's Stop." I thanked her and hung up. Then I checked my credit card statement online. There was no charge for gas that night, but there was something else that made my blood run cold. According to my bank, my card had been used at Murphy's Stop at 11:47 p.m. for $47.50. I've driven that route dozens of times since then, always during the day. I've never seen any sign of a gas station at that location. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I think about those two cars in the parking lot. I think about the people sitting inside them, waiting, and I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next person who needs gas and doesn't ask too many questions. The charge on my credit card statement disappeared after about a week. My bank said it was probably just a processing error. But I know what I saw that night, and I know I'll never stop at another isolated gas station after dark, no matter how empty my tank gets. The Pineview Motel wasn't the kind of place you'd choose to stay if you had other options. But it was 2 a.m. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, and it was the only place with a vacancy sign between me and another 100 miles of empty Wyoming highway. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, my headlights cutting through a light snow that had just started falling. The office was a small building attached to a long row of rooms, all painted the same faded blue color. A few of the rooms had cars parked in front of them, but most were dark. I could see a light on in the office window, so I grabbed my wallet and headed inside. The man behind the counter looked like he'd been there for decades. He was probably in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and thick glasses. The office smelled like cigarettes and old coffee, and there was a small TV in the corner playing what looked like a late-night talk show with the sound turned down. "Need a room?" he asked before I could say anything. "Yeah, just for the night. Something clean and quiet." He nodded and pulled out an old-fashioned registration book, the kind with carbon paper copies. "I've got room 237 available. It's at the far end, so it'll be nice and quiet for you." I filled out the registration form and paid cash. He handed me an actual metal key. Not a key card, but an old-style key with a plastic tag that said 237 in faded numbers. "Checkout's at 11, he said. "Ice machines by room 220, and there's coffee in the morning starting at 6. I thanked him and walked back to my car. Room 237 was indeed at the far end of the building, past all the other occupied rooms. As I drove down to park in front of it, I noticed that the rooms on either side, 235 and 239, were both empty, with no cars parked outside. The room itself was exactly what I expected from a budget motel. 2 double beds with floral bedspreads, a small table with 2 chairs, a TV that looked like it was from the 1990s, and a bathroom with a shower that had seen better days. But it was clean enough, and I was too tired to care about anything else. I brought in my overnight bag, took a quick shower, and got ready for bed. It was almost 3 a.m. by then, and I was exhausted. I turned off the lights, got under the covers of the bed closest to the window, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard the first knock. It was soft, just 3 gentle taps on the door. I figured it might be the desk clerk or maybe someone who had the wrong room. I waited to see if they'd knock again or say something, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I started to drift off again. Then I heard it again. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced. This time I got up and looked through the peephole. The parking lot outside was empty except for my car and the few others I'd seen earlier. No one was standing at my door. "Hello," I called out softly. No response. I went back to bed, but I was more alert now. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, like someone walking back and forth in front of my room. I got up and looked through the peephole again. Nothing. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I was starting to think maybe it was just the motel settling or the wind, but then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone was trying the door handle. I watched the handle, and sure enough, it was moving slightly. Someone was definitely trying to open the door. I'd locked it and put the chain on when I came in, but seeing that handle move was terrifying. "Who's there?" I called out, louder this time. The handle stopped moving immediately. I waited by the door for several minutes, listening, but I didn't hear anything else. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little sound made me jump. Around 4 a.m., I finally started to relax. That's when I heard the knocking again, but this time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the wall behind my bed, the wall that separated my room from room 235. The knocks were rhythmic, like someone was tapping out a pattern. 3 quick knocks. Pause. 3 quick knocks. Pause. It went on for about 5 minutes, then stopped. I got up and put my ear to the wall. I couldn't hear anything from the other side. No TV, no movement, nothing. But I remembered that there hadn't been a car parked outside room 235 when I arrived. The knocking started again, but now it was coming from the other wall, the one between my room and room 239. Same pattern, same rhythm. 3 quick knocks. Pause. 3 quick knocks. I was getting seriously freaked out now. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but I didn't have any signal. I tried the room phone, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. The knocking continued, alternating between the 2 walls. Sometimes it would be soft, almost gentle. Other times it was loud enough to make the pictures on the walls rattle. But it never stopped for more than a few minutes at a time. Around 5 a.m., I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bag and got ready to leave. As I was putting on my shoes, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a voice, muffled but clearly coming from one of the adjacent rooms. "Don't leave," the voice said. It sounded like a woman, but there was something wrong with it. It was too high, too sing-song. "Don't leave us alone." I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. As I was unlocking it, I heard the voice again, but now it was coming from the other side. "We've been waiting," it said. "We've been waiting so long." I yanked the door open and ran to my car. As I was throwing my bag in the back seat, I looked up at the windows of rooms 235 and 239. Both rooms were completely dark, but I could see shapes moving behind the curtains. I got in my car and drove straight to the office. The same man was behind the counter, reading a newspaper. "Checking out early?" he asked, looking up at me. "Yeah, There was some noise from the rooms next to mine. People knocking on the walls. Talking." He frowned and looked at a chart behind the counter. "That's strange. Rooms 235 and 239 are both empty. Have been for weeks." I stared at him. "Empty. But I heard people in there. Someone was knocking and I heard voices." He shook his head. "No, sir. You were the only guest in that section last night. Maybe it was the pipes or something. These old buildings make all kinds of sounds." I wanted to argue with him, but something about his expression made me stop. He was looking at me like he knew exactly what I'd experienced, but he wasn't going to admit it. I left the key on the counter and walked out. As I was getting in my car, I took one last look at room 237. The door was closed and everything looked normal, but as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rear-view mirror. There was someone standing in the window of room 237, watching me leave. It looked like a woman in a white dress, but I couldn't make out her face. She was perfectly still, just standing there behind the curtain. I drove for 3 hours straight before I stopped again, and when I did, it was at a well-lit truck stop with plenty of other people around. I looked up the Pineview Motel online and found dozens of reviews. Most of them were what you'd expect, complaints about outdated rooms and poor service. But there were a few that mentioned strange noises at night, particularly in rooms 235, 237, and 239. One review, posted just 2 weeks before my stay, said, "Heard knocking on the walls all night in room 237. Front desk claimed the adjacent rooms were empty, but someone was definitely there. Would not recommend staying in that section of the motel." I never found out what was really going on at the Pineview Motel, but I drive a different route now when I'm traveling through Wyoming, even if it takes longer. And I always make sure to book my hotel rooms in advance, so I never have to stop at another roadside motel in the middle of the night. Sometimes I still think about that woman in the window, standing there in her white dress, watching me drive away. I wonder if she's still there, waiting in room 237 for the next traveler who has nowhere else to go. I took the job at the highway maintenance station because I needed the money and didn't mind working nights. It was just me and one other guy, rotating 12-hour shifts to monitor traffic conditions and respond to emergencies along a 60-mile stretch of Interstate 70 in eastern Colorado. The pay was decent, and most nights were quiet, just truckers and late-night travelers passing through. The station was located at mile marker 84, about 40 miles from the nearest town in either direction. It was a small building with a radio room, a break area, and a garage for the maintenance vehicles. During my shift, from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., I was responsible for monitoring weather conditions, responding to accident calls, and doing periodic checks on the road conditions. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks when I started noticing something strange. Every night around 2:30 a.m., the same car would pass by heading west. It was an old sedan, maybe from the late 1980s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the darkness. The car always drove exactly the speed limit, never faster or slower, and it never had its headlights on. At first, I thought maybe the driver just had a burned-out headlight and hadn't noticed. But after seeing it several nights in a row, I realized both headlights were off. The car was driving in complete darkness, somehow staying perfectly in its lane. I mentioned it to Jake, the guy who worked the day shift, when he came in one morning. "Yeah, I've heard about that," he said. "Some of the other guys have seen it too. Been going on for years, apparently." "Years, and nobody's ever stopped it?" Jake shrugged. How are you going to stop a car when you don't have any authority to pull people over? Besides, it's not like it's causing any problems. Never seen it in an accident or anything. But it was bothering me. Driving without headlights at night on an interstate was incredibly dangerous, not just for the driver, but for everyone else on the road. I decided that if I saw it again, I'd call it into the State Patrol. The next night, I was ready. I had the radio tuned to the State Patrol frequency, and I was watching the road carefully around 2:30. Sure enough, right on schedule, I saw the car approaching from the east. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly through the large windows of the station. It was definitely an old sedan, dark-colored, and the headlights were definitely off. But as it passed directly in front of the station, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The car had no license plate, front or back, just empty spaces where the plates should have been. I grabbed the radio and called the State Patrol. "This is Highway Maintenance Station 84. I've got a vehicle traveling westbound with no headlights and no license plates. Dark sedan, probably late 80s model." The dispatcher came back immediately. "Copy that, Station 84. Do you have a mile marker reference?" "It just passed mile marker 84, heading west. Should be approaching mile marker 83 now. We'll have a unit check it out. Thanks for the call." I waited, expecting to hear radio chatter about the patrol car catching up with the sedan. But after an hour, there was nothing. I called back. "This is Station 84. Any update on that vehicle I reported?" "Stand by, Station 84. There was a long pause. Then, "Our unit checked the area and didn't see any vehicle matching that description. Are you sure about what you saw?" I was sure, but I told them maybe I'd been mistaken about the details. The next night, I was determined to get more information. I set up a video camera pointing at the road, and I had my phone ready to take pictures. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the car appeared again. This time, I was ready. I started recording as the car approached, and I took several pictures with my phone as it passed. The car looked exactly the same. Old sedan, no headlights, no license plates. But in the pictures, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside, even with the camera flash. I uploaded the pictures to my computer and enhanced them as much as I could. In one of the photos, I could just barely make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. But the figure looked wrong somehow. The proportions seemed off, like the head was too large or the shoulders too narrow. I decided to do some research. I spent my lunch break at the local library, looking through old newspaper archives for any accidents or incidents involving dark sedans on that stretch of highway. What I found made me wish I hadn't looked. In 1987, there had been a fatal accident at mile marker 82, just 2 miles west of the station. A family of 4 in a dark blue sedan had crashed into a bridge abutment during a snowstorm. The article said the car had been traveling at night with defective headlights, and the driver had apparently become disoriented in the storm. The family's name was Morrison, Robert and Linda Morrison, and their 2 children, ages 8 and 10. The article included a photo of the car after the accident. It was the same make and model I'd been seeing every night. But here's the thing that really got to me. The accident had happened on October 15th, 1987. I checked the calendar. It was October 15th, 2019, exactly 32 years later. That night, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I kept watching the clock, waiting for 2:30. When the time came, I was standing right at the window, staring down the highway. The car appeared right on schedule, but this time, I noticed something different. As it passed the station, the car slowed down slightly. Not much, just enough to be noticeable. And as it passed directly in front of the building, I could swear I saw a face in the passenger window. Pale, indistinct, but definitely looking right at me. I grabbed my radio and called the State Patrol again, but this time I didn't mention the car. Instead, I asked them to check on a possible stranded motorist near mile marker 82. "Copy that, Station 84. We'll have a unit check the area." About 20 minutes later, the radio crackled. Station 84, this is Unit 47. I'm at mile marker 82 and I need you to confirm something. Are you showing any emergency calls or incident reports for this location? Negative, Unit 47. Just requested a welfare check for a possible stranded motorist. There was a long pause. Station 84. I'm looking at what appears to be a fresh accident scene here. Vehicle versus bridge abutment, but this doesn't make sense. The car looks like it's been here for years, but the damage looks recent. I felt a chill run down my spine. Unit 47, can you describe the vehicle? Dark blue sedan, late 80s model, extensive front-end damage, no plates visible. But here's the weird part. There's no skid marks, no debris field, nothing to indicate when this accident occurred. It's like the car just appeared here. The radio went quiet for several minutes. Then, Station 84. I'm going to need you to contact the county coroner and request a supervisor to this location, and maybe don't mention this on the main frequency. I never found out what else the patrol officer discovered that night. When I came in for my next shift, Jake told me that the highway had been closed for several hours around mile marker 82 for what the official report called debris removal. But I knew what had really happened. The Morrison family had finally made it to their destination, 32 years late. I quit that job 2 weeks later. I told my supervisor that I was moving out of state, which was true. But the real reason was that I couldn't handle seeing that car anymore. Because after that night, it wasn't just passing by the station. It was stopping. Every night at 2:30, the dark sedan would pull into the parking lot of the maintenance station and sit there with its engine running. I never saw anyone get out, and I never went outside to investigate, but I could feel them watching me through those tinted windows, waiting for something I wasn't willing to give them. I drive a different route now when I have to travel through Colorado. But sometimes, late at night on other highways, I see cars driving without their headlights on. And I always wonder if they're just people with electrical problems, or if they're families like the Morrisons, still trying to find their way home after all these years. Long-haul trucking isn't for everyone, but I'd been doing it for 15 years and thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. That changed one night in November 2018, when I stopped at a truck stop I'd never noticed before, despite driving that route dozens of times. I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Chicago, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of construction delays outside Flagstaff. It was just past midnight when I hit the stretch of I-40 through New Mexico, and I needed to take my mandatory rest break. My logbook showed I had to stop for at least 8 hours, and I was looking for a truck stop with decent food and clean showers. That's when I saw the sign for Exit 127, Big Jim's Travel Plaza, food, fuel, showers. The weird thing was, I'd driven this route probably 50 times over the years, and I'd never seen that exit before. But I was tired, and maybe I'd just never paid attention to it. The exit ramp curved around a small hill, and when I came round the bend, I could see the truck stop spread out below me. It was huge, bigger than most of the major chains. There were at least 30 truck parking spots, a large building with a restaurant and convenience store, and what looked like a separate building for showers and laundry. But something felt off about the place. All the lights were on, and I could see trucks parked in most of the spots, but there was no movement anywhere. No drivers walking around, no one coming in or out of the buildings, no activity at the fuel pumps. It looked like a movie set after everyone had gone home. I pulled into an empty parking spot near the restaurant and shut down my engine. The silence was immediate and complete. No highway noise. No truck engines idling. Nothing. In 15 years of trucking, I'd never been at a truck stop that quiet. I grabbed my shower bag and headed toward the main building. The automatic doors opened as I approached, and I walked into what looked like a typical truck stop convenience store. Aisles of snacks and drinks, a hot food counter, a few tables and chairs. But again, no people anywhere. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed strangely in the empty space. I waited for a response, then walked toward the back of the store where the shower facilities usually were. There was a hallway with a sign that said showers, 12, and an arrow pointing to the right. I followed it and found a clean, well-maintained shower area with about 10 individual stalls. There was a vending machine that dispensed towels and soap, so I bought what I needed and picked a stall. The shower was hot and the water pressure was good, but the whole time I was in there, I had the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept hearing footsteps in the hallway outside, but every time I stopped to listen carefully, the sounds would stop too. After my shower, I went back to the main store area to get some food. The hot food counter was fully stocked. Fried chicken, pizza, sandwiches, all under heat lamps and looking fresh. But there was still no one behind the counter. I waited for about 10 minutes, calling out occasionally. But no one appeared. Finally, I decided to just take what I wanted and leave money on the counter. I grabbed a couple pieces of chicken, a drink, and a bag of chips. The total should have been around $8, so I left a $10 bill next to the cash register. As I was walking back to my truck, I noticed something that made me stop. All the other trucks in the parking lot were older models, 1990s and early 2000s rigs, the kind you don't see much anymore. And they all had the same thick layer of dust on them, like they'd been sitting there for a long time. I walked over to the closest truck, a red Peterbilt with Oklahoma plates. The windshield was so dusty I could barely see through it, but I could make out someone sitting in the driver's seat. I knocked on the door, but there was no response. The figure didn't move at all. I tried the next truck, a blue Kenworth with Texas plates. Same thing. Someone in the driver's seat, covered in dust, not moving. I checked 4 more trucks, and it was the same story with all of them. Drivers sitting behind the wheel, motionless, like they'd been there for years. By now I was seriously freaked out, but I was also exhausted. I needed to get my rest hours in, and I didn't want to drive any further without sleeping. I went back to my truck, locked all the doors, and tried to settle in for the night, but I couldn't sleep. Every few minutes, I'd hear footsteps outside my truck, like someone was walking around the parking lot. I'd look out the windows, but I never saw anyone moving. The other drivers were still sitting in their trucks, motionless. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of diesel engines starting up, not just 1 or 2, but all of them. Every truck in the parking lot was suddenly running, but none of them moved. They just sat there, engines idling, headlights off. I started my own engine, thinking I'd had enough of this place, but when I tried to put the truck in gear, nothing happened. The transmission wouldn't engage. I tried several times, but the truck wouldn't move. That's when I noticed something in my side mirror. The driver of the truck next to me had turned his head and was looking directly at me. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes looked like empty sockets. As I watched, he raised one hand and pressed it against his window, leaving a dusty handprint on the glass. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to call for help, but all I got was static. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off from the outside world. The engines continued to idle all around me, and now I could see more of the drivers turning to look at me. They all had the same pale, gaunt faces and empty eye sockets. Some of them were getting out of their trucks and walking slowly toward mine. I kept trying to get my transmission to work, pumping the clutch and shifting gears frantically. Finally, something clicked, and I felt the truck lurch forward. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I drove straight out of that parking lot and back onto the highway as fast as I could. In my mirrors, I could see the truck stop getting smaller behind me, but all the lights were still on and the engines were still running. The drivers who had gotten out of their trucks were standing in the parking lot, watching me leave. I drove for 3 hours straight before I stopped again, at a well-known truck stop chain where there were plenty of other drivers around. I tried to look up Big Jim's Travel Plaza online, but I couldn't find any listing for it. I even called the Department of Transportation to ask about Exit 127 on I-40 in New Mexico. The person I spoke to was very helpful, but they told me there was no exit 127 on that stretch of highway. The exits in that area were numbered 126 and 129 with nothing in between. I've driven that route many times since then, always during the day, and I've never seen that exit again. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through that area, I think I can see lights in the distance where the truck stop should be. And I always make sure I have enough fuel to get to the next exit, no matter how tired I am. I talked to other drivers about it, and a few of them had similar stories. Places they'd stopped that shouldn't have existed, truck stops full of drivers who never moved or spoke. Most people think we're just tired and seeing things, but I know what I experienced that night. There are places along America's highways that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Places where time moves differently, where the rules of the normal world don't apply. And sometimes, if you're driving late at night and you're not paying attention, you might find yourself stopping at one of them. If that ever happens to you, my advice is simple. Don't get out of your vehicle, don't try to talk to anyone, and get back on the highway as soon as you can. Because some of the people at those places have been waiting there for a very long time, and they're always looking for new company. Route 50 through Nevada is known as the loneliest road in America, and after driving it at 3 a.m. on a February night in 2020, I can tell you that reputation is well deserved. I was driving from Reno to Denver, taking the scenic route because I had time to kill and wanted to see some new country. What I saw instead was something I'm still trying to understand. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when I realized I was getting dangerously low on gas. The last station I'd seen was over an hour behind me, and according to my GPS, the next town was still 40 miles ahead. That's when I saw the neon sign glowing in the darkness ahead. Mel's Diner, open 24 hours. The diner sat by itself on a flat stretch of desert, connected to the highway by a short gravel road. It was one of those classic aluminum-sided diners that looked like it had been there since the 1950s. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink and blue light across the empty parking lot. I pulled up to the building and got out. The desert air was cold and completely still. No wind, no sound except for the humming of the neon sign. Through the windows, I could see that the diner was lit up inside, but I couldn't see any customers or staff. The front door had a bell that jingled when I opened it, and I stepped into what looked like a perfectly preserved piece of Americana. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, black and white checkered floor. A jukebox in the corner was playing something that sounded like it was from the 1940s, but so quietly I could barely make out the melody. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I took a seat at the counter and waited. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps coming from what I assumed was the kitchen, and a woman emerged through a swinging door behind the counter. She looked like she was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a bun and a pink uniform that matched the neon sign outside. "Sorry to keep you waiting, honey," she said with a warm smile. "Coffee, please. And do you have a payphone? I need to call about getting some gas." She poured coffee into a white ceramic mug and set it in front of me. "Phone's over there by the restroom, but you might want to try the coffee first. It's fresh." The coffee was good, strong, and hot. As I drank it, I looked around the diner more carefully. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but there was something timeless about it, like it existed outside of any particular era. The calendar on the wall showed February 1959, but the clock next to it had no hands. "You don't get many customers out here, do you?" I asked. The waitress smiled. "Oh, we get plenty of folks passing through. Most of them are just looking for directions, though." "Directions to where? Depends on where they're trying to go, doesn't it?" Before I could ask what she meant, I heard the bell on the front door jingle. I turned around to see a man in a suit walking in. He looked like he was from the 1960s. Narrow tie, slicked back hair, the whole look. He nodded at me politely and took a seat in one of the booths. The waitress walked over to him with a menu. "The usual, Mr. Henderson?" "That would be fine, Dolores. Thank you." I watched this interaction with growing confusion. The man had ordered without looking at the menu, and the waitress had known his name. But she'd acted like she didn't get many customers. A few minutes later, the bell jingled again. This time it was a young woman in a 1970s-style dress, followed by an elderly man in overalls who looked like he'd stepped out of the Depression era. They both took seats without saying much, and the waitress seemed to know what they wanted as well. "Excuse me," I said to the waitress when she came back to refill my coffee. "Are these regular customers?" "Oh yes, they've all been coming here for years, decades, some of them." I looked around at the other customers. They were all sitting quietly, eating their food or drinking coffee, but none of them were talking to each other, and none of them seemed to notice me watching them. "Where exactly are we?" I asked. "I mean, what's the name of this town?" The waitress looked puzzled. "This isn't a town, honey. This is just the diner." "But what's it near? What highway are we on?" "Highway 50, of course, the loneliest road in America." I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but I didn't have any signal. The screen showed my location as a blank area with no roads or landmarks marked. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" I asked. "What's Wi-Fi?" I stared at her. "Internet access. For computers." She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "I'm sorry, honey, I don't know what you mean." That's when I started to really pay attention to the other customers. The man in the suit was reading a newspaper, and I could see the date at the top. March 15th, 1967. The woman in the 1970s dress was writing in what looked like a diary with a fountain pen. The elderly man was just staring out the window at the dark desert. I excused myself and walked to the payphone by the restroom. It was an old rotary phone, the kind I hadn't seen in years. I picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. I tried jiggling the hook, but nothing happened. When I came back to the counter, there were even more customers in the diner. A family that looked like they were from the 1950s, a young man in a military uniform from what might have been World War II, a woman in a flapper dress from the 1920s. They were all eating quietly, lost in their own thoughts. "How long have you worked here?" I asked the waitress. "Oh, it feels like forever," she said with a laugh. "Time moves differently out here in the desert. Sometimes I feel like I just started yesterday, and sometimes it feels like I've been here for decades." I finished my coffee and asked for the check. She waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it, honey. The coffee's on the house for travelers." I thanked her and headed for the door. As I was leaving, I heard her call out behind me. "Drive safely now, and remember, not all roads lead where you think they're going." I got back in my car and drove away as quickly as I could. In my rearview mirror, I could see the neon sign getting smaller and smaller, but the diner remained brightly lit against the dark desert. About an hour later, I reached the town my GPS had been directing me to. I stopped at a gas station and asked the attendant about the diner I'd just visited. "Diner?" he said. "There's no diner on Route 50 between here and Reno. Hasn't been for years." I described the location as best I could, but he insisted there was nothing there but empty desert. When I showed him my receipt from the gas station I'd stopped at before the diner, he looked confused. "This says you bought gas 6 hours ago, but according to this timestamp, you should have reached town 2 hours ago. Where have you been?" I couldn't answer that question then, and I still can't answer it now. According to every map and GPS system, there's no diner at that location on Route 50, but I know what I experienced that night. I think about those customers sometimes. People from different eras, all sitting quietly in that timeless space. I wonder if they knew where they were, or if they thought they were just stopping for a quick meal on their way to somewhere else. And I wonder about the waitress, Dolores, who seemed to exist outside of time itself. Was she helping people find their way, or was she keeping them from reaching their destinations? I've driven Route 50 several times since then, always during the day, and I've never seen the diner again. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through other remote areas, I see neon signs glowing in the distance. And I always keep driving, no matter how low my gas tank gets, because some places exist in the spaces between where you've been and where you're going. And once you stop at one of them, you might find that the journey becomes more important than the destination, even if the journey never ends. I've always been a solo camper. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that helps me clear my head and recharge. So when I found what looked like the perfect campground on a Forest Service website, remote, primitive, and rarely used, I knew I had to check it out. The campground was called Pine Ridge, located about 30 miles into the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. According to the website, it had 6 campsites, pit toilets, and a hand pump for water. No reservations required, no fees, just first come, first served primitive camping. Perfect for what I was looking for. I loaded up my truck with camping gear and drove out there on a Thursday in September 2019. The access road was exactly where the website said it would be. A gravel Forest Service road marked with a small brown sign that said Pine Ridge Campground, 8 miles. The road was rough, winding through dense pine forest with no other traffic. After about 40 minutes of careful driving, I reached what should have been the campground. Instead, I found an empty clearing with a rusty sign that said, "Campground closed. Hazardous conditions." I got out of my truck and looked around. There were no campsites, no pit toilets, no water pump, just an empty meadow surrounded by trees. But according to my GPS, this was definitely the right location. I was disappointed, but I figured maybe the website information was outdated. I decided to drive back down the mountain and find somewhere else to camp. But as I was turning my truck around, I noticed something odd. There was a narrow trail leading into the woods on the far side of the clearing, and I could see what looked like a fire ring about 50 yards down the trail. Curious, I grabbed a flashlight and walked over to investigate. The trail was well maintained, with fresh wood chips covering the ground. And sure enough, there was a fire ring made of carefully arranged stones, with a picnic table next to it, and a cleared area that would be perfect for a tent. I followed the trail a little further and found 5 more campsites, each one perfectly set up with fire rings, picnic tables, and level ground for camping. At the end of the trail, there was a small building that housed 2 clean pit toilets and a hand pump that produced clear, cold water when I tested it. Everything was exactly as described on the website, just not where I'd expected to find it. I figured the Forest Service had moved the campground deeper into the woods for some reason and hadn't updated their signs yet. I went back to get my truck, but the Forest Service road didn't extend to the trail. I'd have to carry my gear about a quarter mile through the woods. It was a pain, but the campground was so perfect that I decided it was worth the effort. I set up my tent at the first campsite and got a fire going as the sun started to set. The evening was beautiful. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, and absolute silence, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of wind in the trees. Around 9 p.m., I heard voices coming from deeper in the campground. It sounded like a family setting up camp, parents talking to children, the sound of tent stakes being hammered into the ground. I was a little disappointed that I wouldn't have the place to myself, but I was glad to know I wasn't the only person who'd found this hidden gem. I walked down the trail to introduce myself to my fellow campers, but when I reached the area where I'd heard the voices, there was no one there. The campsite was empty, with no sign that anyone had been there recently. But I could still hear voices, now coming from further down the trail. I followed the sounds, but every time I got close to where they seemed to be coming from, the voices would fade away and start up again from a different direction. After about 20 minutes of this, I gave up and went back to my own campsite. I tried to read by the fire, but I kept hearing things that didn't make sense. Children laughing and playing, even though I'd seen no evidence of any families. The sound of car doors slamming, even though no vehicles could reach the campground. Conversations that seemed to be happening just out of earshot. Around 11 p.m., I decided to turn in for the night. I banked the fire and got into my tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I'd hear footsteps on the trail outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps that would stop whenever I held my breath to listen. I unzipped my tent flap and looked outside. The campground was lit by a nearly full moon, and I could see the entire area clearly. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued. They seemed to be circling my campsite, always just outside my field of vision. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up straight in my sleeping bag. It was the sound of children singing, but the melody was wrong somehow. The tune was familiar. It sounded like row, row, row your boat. But the words were different, and I couldn't make them out clearly. The singing continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound, tent zippers being opened and closed, like people were getting in and out of their tents, but I knew there were no other campers in the area. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The beam of light revealed the empty campground, but I could still hear the sounds of people moving around. Footsteps, whispered conversations, the rustle of sleeping bags. It was like there was an entire family camping in the site next to mine, but they were invisible. I stayed in my tent for the rest of the night, listening to sounds that shouldn't have existed. Around 3 a.m., everything went quiet, and I finally managed to fall asleep. I woke up at sunrise to find my campfire burning brightly, even though I'd banked it hours earlier. Someone had added fresh wood and stirred up the coals. There were also footprints in the dirt around my campsite, small ones that looked like they belonged to children. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hiked back to my truck. As I was loading everything into the bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were handprints on my truck windows, small handprints like children had been pressing their faces against the glass and cupping their hands to see inside. I drove out of there as fast as the rough road would allow. When I got back to town, I went straight to the Forest Service office to ask about Pine Ridge Campground. The ranger I spoke to looked confused when I described the location. "There's no campground by that name in this forest," he said, "and we don't have any primitive campgrounds in that area." I showed him the website where I'd found the information, but when we looked it up together, there was no listing for Pine Ridge Campground. The website showed several other campgrounds in the forest, but not the one I'd visited. "Are you sure about the location?" he asked. "Maybe you were in a different forest." I was sure. I showed him the GPS coordinates I'd recorded, and he pulled up a map of that area on his computer. According to the Forest Service records, that location had never been developed as a campground. It was just wilderness area, with no facilities of any kind. But then he paused and looked more carefully at the map. "Huh," he said. "That's interesting." "What?" "Well, according to these old records, there was a family that went missing in that area back in 1987. Parents and 3 kids, camping illegally in an undeveloped area. They were never found, despite extensive search efforts." He pulled up the missing persons report on his computer. The family's name was Patterson, Mark and Susan Patterson, and their children ages 6, 8, and 10. They'd told friends they were going camping in a secret spot they'd discovered, but they'd never provided specific directions. "The search teams covered that entire area," the ranger said. "Never found any trace of them or their campsite. It's been one of the forest's unsolved mysteries for over 30 years. I thanked him and left, but I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd told me. That night I did some research online and found newspaper articles about the Patterson family disappearance. There were photos of the family, and when I saw the pictures of the 3 children, I felt a chill run through me. They looked exactly like the size of the footprints I'd seen around my campsite. I've never been back to that area. and I've never found another reference to Pine Ridge Campground online. But sometimes, when I'm camping alone in other remote areas, I think about the Patterson family. I wonder if they're still out there, still camping in their secret spot, waiting for other visitors to share their hidden campground. And I wonder if the voices I heard that night were trying to warn me about something, or if they were trying to convince me to stay, because part of me, a small, dark part, almost wanted to. There was something peaceful about that place, something that made it feel like time had stopped and the outside world didn't matter anymore. But I'm glad I left when I did, because I have a feeling that if I'd stayed another night, I might never have found my way back to the real world. Some places exist outside of maps and GPS coordinates, in the spaces between what's real and what's possible. And sometimes the people who find those places decide they don't want to leave. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years, and I've always been a fan of late-night radio. There's something comforting about having a voice in the cab with you during those long, lonely hours on the highway. AM radio picks up signals from hundreds of miles away at night, so I'm always scanning the dial, looking for talk shows, music, or anything to keep me company. That's how I found WKRP 1340 AM. I was driving through eastern Montana on a clear October night in 2019, hauling a load of farm equipment from Minnesota to Oregon. It was about 2:30 a.m. and I was getting tired of the static-filled classic rock station I'd been listening to. I started scanning through the AM dial, looking for something better. That's when I picked up a signal that was coming in crystal clear, clearer than any AM station had a right to be in the middle of nowhere, Montana. A smooth, professional voice was speaking. You're listening to WKRP 1340 AM, where the night never ends and the music never stops. I'm your host, Johnny Midnight, and I'll be with you until the sun comes up. It's 2:33 a.m. on this beautiful October night, and if you're out there on the highway, driving through the darkness, this one's for you. The voice was followed by a song I'd never heard before, something that sounded like it was from the 1950s, but with lyrics that seemed to be about truck driving and life on the road. It was exactly the kind of thing I wanted to hear at that moment. Over the next hour, Johnny Midnight played a perfect mix of music, classic country, old rock and roll, and songs I'd never heard but somehow felt familiar with. Between songs, he'd talk about life on the highway, the loneliness of the road and the brotherhood of drivers who spent their nights traveling through the darkness. "I know you're out there," he said during one break. "I can see your headlights cutting through the night, carrying your loads from one end of this great country to the other. You're the backbone of America, and don't let anyone tell you different." It was like he was speaking directly to me. I'd never heard a DJ who understood the trucking life so well, or who could capture the feeling of being alone on the highway at 3 a.m. Around 3:30, Johnny started taking call-ins from listeners. The first caller was a trucker named Bill, driving through Nevada. "Johnny, I just wanted to say thanks for keeping us company out here. Your show is the best thing on the radio." "Thanks, Bill. What are you hauling tonight?" "Electronics from California to Denver. Been listening to your show for about 6 months now, and it's gotten me through some tough nights." "That's what we're here for, Bill. Drive safe out there." The next caller was a woman named Sarah, driving through Texas. "Johnny, I'm a new driver. Just got my CDL 3 months ago. Your show helps me feel less scared when I'm driving at night." "You're doing great, Sarah. We've all been where you are. The night can be intimidating at first, but you'll learn to love it. There's a peace out there in the darkness that you can't find anywhere else." I decided to call in myself. I grabbed my CB radio, but realized I didn't know how to reach the station. Johnny hadn't given out a phone number. But as I was thinking about it, my CB crackled to life. "Go ahead, caller. You're on WKRP 1340. I was confused. I hadn't keyed the mic or dialed any number, but Johnny was clearly waiting for me to speak. Hi, Johnny. This is Dave, driving through Montana. Hey, Dave, thanks for calling. What's on your mind tonight? I just wanted to say I really enjoy your show. I've never heard of WKRP before, but you really understand what it's like out here. That's because I've been there, Dave. I've driven every highway in this country, seen every sunrise and sunset from behind the wheel. Now I try to keep other drivers company during the dark hours. What are you hauling tonight? Farm equipment, Minnesota to Oregon. That's a good run. You'll see some beautiful country when the sun comes up. Drive safe out there, Dave. Thanks, Johnny. I hung up, feeling better than I had in weeks. There was something about Johnny's voice that was incredibly reassuring, like talking to an old friend who really understood your life. I listened to the show for another hour, until about 4:30 a.m. Johnny played more great music and took more calls from drivers all across the country. Everyone seemed to know the show well, like they'd been listening for months or years. As dawn started to break, Johnny's voice came back on. Well, folks, we're coming to the end of another night here at WKRP 1340. The sun's starting to rise, which means it's time for me to sign off. But don't worry, I'll be back tomorrow night at midnight, ready to keep you company through the dark hours. Until then, keep the shiny side up and the rubber side down. This is Johnny Midnight, signing off. The signal faded to static, and I couldn't pick it up again no matter how I adjusted the dial. I thought about that show all day, and I couldn't wait to tune in again the next night. At exactly midnight, I started scanning the dial around 13:40 a.m. Sure enough, Johnny's voice came through loud and clear. Good evening, night owls and highway warriors. You're listening to WKRP 1340 AM, and I'm Johnny Midnight. It's a beautiful night for driving, and I've got 4 hours of the best music and conversation to keep you company. I became a regular listener. Every night from midnight to 4 a.m., I'd tune in to Johnny's show. He always played exactly the right music, always knew exactly what to say to make the long, lonely hours pass more quickly. And the callers were always interesting. Drivers from all over the country, all dealing with the same challenges and experiences I was. This went on for about 3 weeks. Then, one night in November, something different happened. I was listening to Johnny take a call from a driver named Mike, who was talking about his route through Colorado. But there was something familiar about Mike's voice. After a few seconds, I realized why. It was my voice. Mike was telling Johnny about hauling farm equipment from Minnesota to Oregon, using the exact same words I'd used when I called in weeks earlier. I grabbed my CB radio to call in and ask what was going on, but before I could key the mic, Johnny's voice came through. Dave, I know you're listening. Don't try to call in tonight. Just listen. I was stunned. How did he know I was about to call? You've been a faithful listener for 3 weeks now, Johnny continued, and I want you to know how much I appreciate that. But I think it's time you knew the truth about WKRP 1340. The music stopped, and there was silence for a long moment. I died in 1987, Johnny said, his voice suddenly sounding distant and hollow. Truck accident on I-80 in Wyoming. Jackknifed in a snowstorm and went over an embankment. They didn't find my body for 3 days. I felt a chill run through me, but I couldn't stop listening. I'd been a trucker for 15 years before that, and a radio DJ before I started driving. When I died, I found myself stuck, I guess you could say, caught between this world and whatever comes next. But I discovered I could still broadcast, still reach out to other drivers who were traveling through the dark hours. The signal started to fade in and out like it was coming from very far away. All the callers you've heard over the past 3 weeks, they're all drivers who died on the highways over the years. Bill died in Nevada in 1995. Sarah died in Texas just 2 years ago. Mike died in Colorado in 2003, hauling the same load you described. I pulled over to the side of the highway, my hands shaking. We keep broadcasting because we don't want other drivers to feel alone out there. The highway can be a dangerous place, especially at night. but it doesn't have to be a lonely place. The signal was getting weaker, Johnny's voice fading in and out. "Dave, you're a good driver, and you've got many safe miles ahead of you. But when your time comes, and it will come for all of us eventually, remember that there's a place for drivers like us. A place where the night never ends and the music never stops." The signal died completely, leaving only static. I sat there for a long time trying to process what I'd just heard. Part of me wanted to believe it was just an elaborate prank, or maybe I'd been hallucinating from too many nights of poor sleep. But deep down, I knew Johnny had been telling the truth. I tried to find WKRP 1340 AM again over the next few weeks, but I never picked up the signal. I searched online for any information about the station, but found nothing. I even called the FCC to ask about licensed stations broadcasting on 1340 AM, but they had no record of WKRP. That was over 4 years ago. I still drive the same routes, still scan the AM dial during those long night hours, and sometimes, just sometimes, I pick up fragments of Johnny's voice. A few words here and there, or a snatch of one of those songs that seemed so familiar. I don't know if I'll ever hear the full show again, but I'm not afraid of the dark hours anymore, because I know that somewhere out there, in the spaces between the static, Johnny Midnight and his fellow drivers are still broadcasting, still keeping watch over those of us who travel through the night, and when my time comes to join them, I know I'll have good company for the journey. Interstate 80 through Nebraska is one of the most boring stretches of highway in America. It's just flat farmland for hundreds of miles, with nothing to break up the monotony except the occasional grain elevator or small town. But it was on this unremarkable highway that I had one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. I was driving from San Francisco to New York in March 2020, moving cross-country for a new job. I'd been on the road for 2 days and was somewhere in the middle of Nebraska when I started getting tired. It was about 1 a.m. and I'd been driving since early morning with only brief stops for gas and food. I started looking for a place to pull over and take a nap. That's when I saw the sign, "Rest Area, Mile 247, 2 miles." Perfect. I could sleep in my car for a few hours and then continue driving in the morning. The rest area was typical for Nebraska. A small parking lot with maybe 20 spaces, a brick building with restrooms and vending machines, and a few picnic tables scattered around. There were 2 other cars in the parking lot when I arrived, both parked near the building. I parked at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and reclined my seat. The rest area was well lit by tall sodium lights, which made me feel safer about sleeping in my car. I locked the doors, set my phone alarm for 6 a.m. and closed my eyes. I was just starting to drift off when I heard car doors slamming. I opened my eyes and saw that both of the other cars were leaving. Their headlights swept across my car as they pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the interstate. Now I was completely alone. I tried to go back to sleep, but something was bothering me. The rest area was too quiet. There were no sounds from the interstate, which was strange because I-80 carries heavy truck traffic all night long. I should have been hearing the constant sound of vehicles passing by, but there was nothing. I sat up and looked around. The rest area looked exactly the same as when I'd arrived, but something felt different. The lights seemed dimmer, and the shadows between them seemed darker and more pronounced. That's when I noticed the building. When I'd first arrived, it had looked like a typical rest area facility. Clean, modern, well-maintained. But now it looked older, more weathered. The brick was darker, and some of the windows looked like they were boarded up. I got out of my car to get a better look. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit by a smell that made me gag. Something like rotting garbage mixed with stagnant water. The smell was coming from the direction of the building. I walked closer, covering my nose with my shirt. The building definitely looked different than it had when I arrived. The brick was stained and crumbling in places, and several of the windows were indeed boarded up with plywood. But strangest of all, there were no lights on inside. The building looked abandoned. I tried the front door, but it was locked. I walked around to the side and found another door that was slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open and looked inside. The interior was a disaster. The floor was covered with debris, broken glass, chunks of concrete, pieces of metal. The walls were stained with something dark, and there was standing water in several places. It looked like the building had been abandoned for years, but that was impossible. I'd seen it just an hour earlier, and it had been in perfect condition. I backed out of the building and returned to my car, thoroughly freaked out. I decided I'd had enough of this place and would find somewhere else to sleep. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I tried several more times, but the car was completely dead. No lights, no radio, nothing. I popped the hood and looked at the engine, but I'm not mechanically inclined and couldn't see anything obviously wrong. I decided to call for roadside assistance, but when I pulled out my phone, I saw that I had no signal. Not even one bar. That was strange because I'd had full signal when I arrived. I was starting to panic. I was alone at an abandoned rest area in the middle of nowhere, with a dead car and no way to call for help. I decided to walk out to the interstate and try to flag down a passing vehicle, but when I reached the edge of the rest area, I stopped dead in my tracks. The interstate was gone. Where I-80 should have been, there was nothing but empty grassland stretching off into the darkness. No road, no guardrails, no signs. Just prairie grass swaying in the wind. I stood there for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This had to be some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. There was no way an entire interstate highway could just disappear. I walked back to my car and sat down to think. Maybe if I waited until morning, everything would return to normal. Maybe I was just having some kind of breakdown from the stress of moving across the country. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the abandoned building. I looked toward the sound and saw a figure walking across the parking lot toward me. It was too dark to make out any details, but the person was moving in an odd, shambling way. I got back in my car and locked the doors. The figure continued approaching, and as it got closer, I could see that something was very wrong with it. The person, if it was a person, was wearing what looked like the uniform of a rest area maintenance worker, but the clothes were torn and stained. And the way it moved, it was like its joints weren't working properly. The figure reached my car and pressed its face against the driver's side window. In the dim light from the parking lot lamps, I could see its features clearly for the first time. The skin was pale and waxy, and the eyes were completely white. No pupils, no iris, just solid white. The mouth was open in what might have been a smile, but it showed too many teeth. It raised one hand and tapped on the window with a fingernail that was far too long. The sound was like a pencil tapping on glass, but much louder. It tapped out a rhythm. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause. I sat frozen in terror as the thing continued tapping on my window. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, it stopped tapping and walked away, back toward the building. I watched it disappear into the shadows. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my car, afraid to move or make any sound. Every few minutes I'd hear footsteps or see movement in the shadows around the building. Sometimes there seemed to be multiple figures moving around out there, but I never got a clear look at any of them. As dawn started to break, I noticed something incredible happening. The abandoned building was slowly changing back to its original condition. The boarded windows became clear glass again, the stained brick became clean, and lights began to appear in the interior. By the time the sun was fully up, the rest area looked exactly as it had when I'd first arrived. Clean, modern, and well-maintained. And when I looked toward where the interstate should be, there it was, I-80 in all its boring Nebraska glory, with trucks and cars passing by at regular intervals. I tried starting my car, and the engine turned over immediately. My phone showed full signal. Everything was back to normal, except for the lingering smell of rot that seemed to cling to my clothes. I drove out of that rest area as fast as I could and didn't stop until I reached the next town, about 50 miles down the road. I went straight to a diner and ordered coffee, trying to process what had happened. The waitress was friendly and talkative, so I decided to ask her about the rest area. "Oh, you mean the one at mile 247, she said. "That place has a reputation around here. Lot of strange stories over the years." "What kind of stories?" "People stopping there at night and having unusual experiences. Some folks say the place changes after dark, becomes something different. Most of the locals avoid it." "Has anyone ever reported it to the authorities?" She shrugged. "What would they report? That a rest area looks different at night, that they saw things that weren't there. Who's going to believe that?" I finished my coffee and got back on the road. I drove straight through to New York without stopping at any more rest areas, sleeping in hotel rooms every night. I've never been back to Nebraska, but I've done some research on that rest area. I found several online forums where people shared similar stories: cars breaking down, the interstate disappearing, strange figures in maintenance uniforms. But there's no official record of any problems at that location. The Nebraska Department of Transportation lists the rest area at mile 247 as a standard facility with no history of complaints or incidents. According to their records, it's been in continuous operation since 1987, with regular maintenance and cleaning. But I know what I experienced that night, and I know I'm not the only one. There are places along America's highways that exist in multiple states at the same time. Normal during the day, something else entirely after dark. Places where the boundary between our world and somewhere else becomes thin. If you ever find yourself at the rest area at mile 247 on I-80 in Nebraska, my advice is simple. Don't stop after sunset. Keep driving until you reach a town with other people around. Because some places are meant to be passed by, not visited. And if you do stop there during the day, pay attention to the maintenance workers. Look at their eyes and make sure they're the right color. Because some of the staff at that rest area have been working there much longer than they should have been able to. I should have known something was wrong when I found a beautiful Victorian house in rural Ohio for $30 a night. But I was driving from Chicago to Philadelphia for a job interview, and I needed somewhere cheap to stay for one night. The Airbnb listing for the house in Millfield looked too good to be true. A fully restored 1890s home with period furnishings, great reviews, and an incredibly low price. The host's name was Margaret, and she'd sent me detailed instructions for finding the house. Millfield wasn't much of a town, just a few dozen houses scattered along a country road with no businesses or services that I could see. The house itself was at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by mature oak trees. It was even more beautiful in person than in the photos. 3 stories of perfectly maintained Victorian architecture with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. The yard was immaculate, with flower gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. I parked in the circular driveway and walked up to the front door. Margaret had told me the key would be in a lockbox by the door, and sure enough, there it was. The combination she'd given me worked perfectly, and I let myself into the house. The interior was stunning. Everything had been restored to period perfection. Hardwood floors, ornate wallpaper, antique furniture that looked like museum pieces. The front hallway had a grand staircase leading to the second floor, and I could see a formal dining room and parlor through doorways on either side. I found a note from Margaret on the dining room table, written in elegant handwriting on cream-colored stationery. "Welcome to Millfield House. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please make yourself at home and don't hesitate to contact me if you need anything. The master bedroom is on the second floor, first door on the right. Breakfast will be served at 8 a.m. in the dining room. Margaret. I was impressed by the attention to detail. Most Airbnb hosts just sent a text message with basic information, but Margaret had gone above and beyond to make me feel welcome. I carried my bag upstairs and found the master bedroom. It was gorgeous, a 4-poster bed with a canopy, antique dresser and armoire, and windows that looked out over the gardens. The bathroom was down the hall and had been updated with modern plumbing while maintaining the Victorian aesthetic. I unpacked my things and went downstairs to explore the rest of the house. The kitchen was in the back, and like everything else, it was a perfect blend of period charm and modern functionality. The refrigerator was stocked with bottled water and snacks, and there was a note saying I was welcome to anything I found. As evening approached, I settled into the parlor with a book I'd brought along. The room was lit by several antique lamps, and there was a fire already laid in the fireplace. I lit it and spent a pleasant evening reading and relaxing. Around 10 p.m. I started hearing sounds from upstairs. Footsteps, mostly, like someone walking around on the third floor. I assumed it was Margaret, preparing for the next day or doing some cleaning. The sounds continued for about an hour, then stopped. I went to bed around 11 p.m. and fell asleep almost immediately. The bed was incredibly comfortable, and I slept better than I had in weeks. I woke up around 7 a.m. to the smell of bacon cooking. Margaret was apparently already preparing breakfast, which was impressive dedication to customer service. I got dressed and went downstairs to the dining room. The table was set for 2 people, with fine china and silver that looked genuinely antique. There was fresh orange juice, coffee, and a plate of pastries. But I didn't see Margaret anywhere. "Hello?" I called out. "Margaret?" No response. I walked to the kitchen, but it was empty. The stove was on, and there was bacon cooking in a cast-iron skillet, but no one was there to tend it. I turned off the burner and moved the pan to prevent the bacon from burning. I waited in the dining room for about 20 minutes, but Margaret never appeared. Finally, I decided to eat the breakfast she'd prepared and leave a thank-you note. The food was excellent: fresh eggs, perfectly cooked bacon, homemade biscuits with honey butter. As I was finishing breakfast, I heard footsteps upstairs again. This time, they seemed to be coming from the second floor in the area near my bedroom. I called out again, but got no response. I went upstairs to pack my things and check out. As I was putting my clothes in my bag, I noticed something odd. The bed had been made while I was downstairs eating breakfast. The sheets were perfectly tucked, and the pillows were arranged exactly as they had been when I arrived. But I hadn't made the bed, and I was sure Margaret hadn't come into the room while I was downstairs, because I would have heard her on the stairs. I finished packing quickly and went back downstairs. I left a 5-star review on my phone and wrote a thank-you note for Margaret, which I left on the dining room table along with the key. As I was walking to my car, I noticed something that made me stop. There was another car in the driveway, an old sedan that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. It looked like it was from the 1950s or 1960s, perfectly maintained but clearly vintage. I looked back at the house, wondering if Margaret had returned while I was upstairs, but I didn't see anyone at the windows, and the front door was still closed. I got in my car and drove away, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious breakfast and the made bed. Margaret had been the perfect host, but I'd never actually seen her. It was like she was a ghost, taking care of guests without ever being present. About an hour down the road, I realized I'd forgotten to ask Margaret about checkout procedures. I pulled over and called the number listed in the Airbnb app. The phone rang several times, then went to voicemail. But the message wasn't what I expected. "You have reached a number that is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." I hung up and tried again, thinking I'd dialed wrong. Same message. I checked the number in the app. It was definitely correct. Confused, I decided to send Margaret a message through the Airbnb platform, thanking her for the wonderful stay. But when I tried to access her profile, I got an error message. This listing is no longer available. I pulled up the listing I'd booked, but it was gone. According to the app, I had no current or recent reservations. It was like the Millfield house had never existed in the Airbnb system. I tried searching for other listings in Millfield, Ohio, but found nothing. I even tried searching for the house by address, but the street name didn't come up in any results. Getting more confused by the minute, I decided to call Airbnb customer service. After being on hold for 20 minutes, I finally reached a representative. "I'm trying to find information about a listing I stayed at last night," I told her, "but it seems to have disappeared from the system." "I can help you with that. What's your confirmation number?" I gave her the number from my email confirmation. There was a long pause. "Sir, I'm not showing any reservations under your account for the past month. Are you sure you have the right confirmation number?" I double-checked the email. The number was correct, but according to Airbnb, I'd never made a reservation for Millfield House. "Is it possible the listing was removed while I was staying there?" I asked. "That's very unlikely. Even if a listing is removed, we maintain records of completed stays for billing and review purposes. But I'm not showing any record of you staying anywhere in Ohio." I thanked her and hung up, more confused than ever. I checked my credit card statement on my phone, but there was no charge from Airbnb for the previous night. According to my bank, I'd never paid for the reservation, but I knew I'd stayed at that house. I had photos on my phone of the beautiful rooms, and I could still taste the breakfast Margaret had prepared. It had been one of the most pleasant travel experiences I'd ever had. When I got home to Chicago, I decided to do some research on Millfield, Ohio. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the Ohio Historical Society, Millfield had been a thriving small town in the late 1800s. The town's most prominent resident had been Margaret Whitmore, who lived in a large Victorian house at the end of Main Street. Margaret had been known for her hospitality, often taking in travelers who needed a place to stay. But in 1897, there had been a tragic fire. Margaret's house had burned down during a dinner party, killing Margaret and several guests. The town had never recovered from the tragedy, and most residents had moved away over the following decades. Today, Millfield was listed as a ghost town. According to the historical records, there were no permanent residents and no standing structures from the original settlement. I stared at the computer screen, trying to process what I was reading. The house I'd stayed in couldn't exist. Margaret Whitmore had died over a century ago. But I had photos on my phone that proved I'd been there, except when I checked my phone, the photos were gone. Not deleted, they'd never existed. My photo library showed no pictures from the previous day. I've never been able to explain what happened to me in Millfield. I've driven back to that area twice looking for the house, but I've never been able to find the right road. GPS systems show no streets or addresses in Millfield, and the few local residents I've talked to insist the town has been abandoned for decades. But I know what I experienced. I stayed in Margaret Whitmore's house, ate her breakfast, and slept in her guest room. She took care of me with the same hospitality she'd shown to travelers over a century ago. I think some people are so committed to helping others that not even death can stop them from fulfilling their purpose. Margaret Whitmore spent her life taking care of guests, and she's still doing it, even though her house burned down in 1897. If you're ever driving through rural Ohio and you see a listing for a beautiful Victorian house at an impossibly low price, you might want to think twice before booking it, not because it's dangerous. Margaret is a wonderful host, but because you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. And if you do decide to stay, make sure to enjoy the breakfast. It's the best you'll ever have, even if you can never prove it happened. I've been driving long haul for 30 years, and I've always had a policy about hitchhikers. I don't pick them up. It's nothing personal. It's just too risky in today's world. But on a cold February night in 2019, driving through the mountains of Colorado on Route 287, I broke my own rule. And I've regretted it ever since. I was hauling a load of furniture from Denver to Billings, Montana, running about 3 hours behind schedule because of a delay at the loading dock. It was snowing lightly, and the temperature was dropping fast. The weather report was calling for a major storm to move through the area overnight. Around 10 p.m., I was climbing through a mountain pass when I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, thumb out, wearing nothing but jeans and a light jacket. No hat, no gloves, no heavy coat, in weather that was already below freezing and getting worse by the minute. I drove past him, like I always do. But something about the situation bothered me. It was the middle of nowhere, at least 20 miles to the nearest town in either direction. If that guy was stuck out there all night in the storm that was coming, he'd probably freeze to death. I wrestled with my conscience for about 5 miles, then made a decision I'd never made before. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and waited. About 10 minutes later, I saw headlights in my mirror. But instead of a car, it was the hitchhiker walking along the shoulder of the road. I rolled down my passenger window as he approached the truck. "Need a ride?" I called out. He jogged over to the truck and I got my first good look at him. He appeared to be in his 30s with dark hair and pale skin. But what struck me most was how calm he seemed. He wasn't shivering, wasn't acting like someone who'd been standing in freezing weather. "Thanks," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. "I really appreciate this." "Where are you headed?" "North. Anywhere north of here would be great." I pulled back onto the highway and introduced myself. "I'm Dave. I'm going as far as Billings, if that helps." "I'm Michael, and yes, that would help a lot." As we drove, I tried to make conversation. I asked him where he was from, what he was doing out on the highway at night in the middle of winter, but his answers were vague and didn't really make sense. "I was visiting friends," he said. "My car broke down and I've been trying to get home." "Where's home?" "North of here." "I mean, what town?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's a small place. You probably haven't heard of it." Something about his evasiveness was starting to make me uncomfortable. But I figured maybe he was just naturally private, or maybe he'd had bad experiences with other drivers asking too many questions. The snow was getting heavier, and I was having to slow down to maintain control of the truck. The road was getting slippery, and visibility was decreasing rapidly. "This is turning into a real storm," I said. "Good thing you got a ride when you did." Michael didn't respond. I glanced over at him and saw that he was staring straight ahead, not blinking. His hands were folded in his lap, and he was sitting perfectly still. "You okay?" I asked. He turned to look at me, and I noticed something strange about his eyes. They were completely black, no iris, no white, just solid black from edge to edge. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired." I focused on the road, trying not to think about what I'd just seen. Maybe it was just the lighting in the cab, or maybe I was more tired than I thought. But those eyes had looked wrong. The storm continued to intensify, and after another hour of driving, I decided I needed to stop. The visibility was almost zero, and the road was becoming treacherous. "I'm going to have to pull over and wait this out," I told Michael. "There's a truck stop about 5 miles ahead." "No," he said quickly. "Don't stop. Keep driving." "I can't see the road anymore. It's not safe. Please, don't stop. I need to keep moving north." There was something urgent in his voice that made me uncomfortable, but I also didn't want to put us both in danger by continuing to drive in whiteout conditions. "I'm sorry, but I have to stop. I can't risk running off the road." Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't understand. I can't stop. Not yet." "Why not?" He turned to look at me again, and this time I was sure about what I saw. His eyes were completely black, and they seemed to be reflecting the light from the dashboard like an animal's eyes. Because they're still looking for me. Who's looking for you? Before he could answer, I saw the lights of the truck stop ahead. I pulled into the parking lot, relieved to be off the dangerous highway. But as soon as I stopped the truck, Michael grabbed my arm. "You have to keep driving," he said. His grip was incredibly strong and his hand was ice cold even through my jacket. "They'll find me if we stop." I tried to pull away from him, but he was stronger than he looked. "Who will find you? What are you talking about?" He released my arm and sat back in his seat. For a moment, he looked almost normal, just a tired, scared man who needed help. But then he spoke, and his voice was different, deeper, with an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "I died on this road 3 years ago," he said. "Car accident during a snowstorm just like this one. But I didn't go where I was supposed to go. I've been trying to get home ever since." I stared at him, not believing what I was hearing. "That's not possible. You're sitting right here." "Look at me," he said. "Really look at me." I looked, and for the first time, I noticed things I should have seen earlier. He wasn't breathing. His chest wasn't moving at all. There was no condensation from his breath in the cold air. And now that I was really paying attention, I realized he had no smell, no body odor, no cologne, nothing. "This isn't real," I said, more to myself than to him. "It's real enough," Michael said. "I've been hitchhiking this road for 3 years, trying to get home. But every time someone picks me up, they eventually stop. And when they stop, they see me for what I really am." I reached for the door handle, but Michael spoke again. "Don't run," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to get home." "Where is home?" "I don't know anymore. I thought I did when I was alive, but now, I just know it's north. Somewhere north of here." I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what was happening. Part of me wanted to believe this was all some kind of elaborate prank, or that I was having a breakdown from too many years on the road. But deep down, I knew Michael was telling the truth. "What happens if you don't get home?" I asked. "I don't know. Maybe I keep hitchhiking forever. Maybe I eventually fade away, or maybe—" He paused, looking out at the swirling snow. "Maybe the things that are looking for me finally catch up." "What things?" He turned those black eyes toward me again. "The things that collect souls that don't go where they're supposed to go." I made a decision that I'm still not sure was right. I started the truck. "Where do you want me to take you?" "Just north. As far north as you can go." I pulled out of the truck stop and back onto the highway. The storm had passed while we were talking, and the road was clear again. I drove for another 4 hours, through the rest of Colorado and into Montana. Michael didn't say much during that time, just sat quietly and watched the landscape pass by. As we approached Billings, he finally spoke. "This is far enough," he said. "You can let me out here." I pulled over at the next exit. Michael opened the door and got out, then turned back to look at me. "Thank you," he said. "You're a good man, Dave. Drive safely." He closed the door and walked away into the darkness. I watched him in my mirrors until he disappeared from sight. I delivered my load in Billings and started the drive back to Denver. When I reached the spot where I'd first seen Michael, I slowed down and looked carefully at the roadside. There was a small memorial cross there that I hadn't noticed before, with flowers that looked fresh despite the winter weather. I stopped and walked over to read the inscription. "Michael Thompson, 1985 from 2016, beloved son and brother. Gone too soon." I've driven that route dozens of times since then, always looking for Michael. I've never seen him again, and I hope that means he finally made it home. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through remote areas, I think about him. and I wonder how many other lost souls are out there, hitchhiking on America's highways, trying to find their way to wherever they're supposed to be. I still don't pick up hitchhikers as a general rule. But if I ever see someone standing by the road in dangerous weather, someone who might not survive the night without help, I think I'll make an exception, because some journeys are too important to make alone, even if they're journeys between this world and the next. The Sunset Motel appeared in my headlights like a mirage, just when I thought I'd have to sleep in my car on the side of some godforsaken highway in Nevada. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, trying to make it from Phoenix to Portland in 2 days, when my GPS decided to take me on what it claimed was a faster route through the middle of nowhere. It was 2:30 a.m., and I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. The road stretched endlessly ahead through barren desert, with no signs of civilization anywhere. That's when the neon sign appeared around a bend. Sunset Motel, vacancy, air conditioning, cable TV. The motel was a classic 1960s roadside establishment, a long single-story building with about 20 rooms, all painted in faded turquoise and pink. The office was at one end, with a neon office sign that buzzed and flickered in the desert night. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot, which wasn't surprising given the remote location. I parked in front of the office and went inside. The interior looked like it hadn't been updated since the motel opened. Wood paneling, shag carpet, and furniture that belonged in a museum. But it was clean, and that was all I cared about. The clerk behind the counter was an elderly man with white hair and thick glasses. He looked up from a paperback novel as I entered. "Need a room?" he asked. "Yeah, just for the night. Something clean and quiet." He nodded and reached for a registration book. Not a computer, but an actual paper ledger. "Room 14 is available. That'll be $45. I filled out the registration form and paid in cash. He handed me a real metal key with a plastic tag that said 14 in faded numbers. "Checkout's at 11, he said. "Ice machines by room 10, and there's coffee in the morning starting at 6. "Oh, and one more thing." "Yeah? Don't go outside after 3 a.m. House rule." I stared at him. "What do you mean, don't go outside?" "Just what I said. Stay in your room between 3 a.m. and sunrise. It's for your own safety." "Is there some kind of problem with crime in the area?" He shook his head. "Not crime. Just stay inside after 3 a.m. Trust me on this." I was too tired to argue with the old man's weird rules. I took the key and walked to room 14, which was in the middle of the long building. The room was exactly what I'd expected. 2 double beds, a small table with 2 chairs, a TV that looked like it was from the 1980s, and a bathroom that had seen better days. But it was clean, and the air conditioning worked. I took a quick shower, set my phone alarm for 8 a.m. and got into bed. It was almost 3 a.m. by then, and I was exhausted. I fell asleep within minutes. I woke up around 3:30 a.m. to the sound of vehicles outside. Multiple engines running at idle, like a convoy had pulled into the parking lot. I got up and looked through the window, but I couldn't see anything clearly through the curtains. I was about to go back to bed when I heard voices, multiple people talking outside, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices had an odd quality to them. They sounded hollow, like they were coming from far away. Curious, I went to the window and carefully pulled the curtain aside to peek out. What I saw made me step back in shock. The parking lot was full of vehicles, but they weren't normal cars and trucks. They looked like they were from different time periods: 1950s sedans, 1960s muscle cars, 1970s station wagons, even some that looked like they were from the 1940s. And they were all in perfect condition, like they'd just rolled off the showroom floor. People were getting out of the vehicles and walking toward the motel rooms. But something was wrong with the way they moved. They walked too slowly, too deliberately, like they were underwater. and they were all dressed in clothes from the eras their cars represented, men in suits and hats, women in dresses and pearls. I watched as they approached various room doors, but instead of using keys, they simply walked through the doors like they weren't there. The doors didn't open. The people just passed through them like ghosts. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must be dreaming, but when I looked again, the scene was still there. More vehicles were arriving, and more people were walking through the walls of the motel rooms. That's when I remembered the clerk's warning, "Don't go outside after 3 a.m. I backed away from the window and sat on the bed, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were these ghosts? Hallucinations brought on by exhaustion? Some kind of elaborate prank? I decided to call the front desk and ask the clerk what was going on. But when I picked up the room phone, there was no dial tone. I tried my cell phone, but I had no signal. The voices outside were getting louder, and now I could hear them more clearly. They were having conversations, but the words didn't make sense. It was like listening to people talk in a language I almost understood, but not quite. I went back to the window and looked out again. The parking lot was now completely full of vintage vehicles, and there were dozens of people walking around. But as I watched, I realized they weren't just walking randomly. They were all moving in the same direction, toward the far end of the motel building. I followed their movement and saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the building, there was a room that hadn't been there when I checked in. The building had definitely ended at room 20, but now there was a room 21, with its door standing wide open, and all the ghostly figures were walking into that room. But here's the thing that really terrified me. The room was glowing with a soft blue light, and I could see that it was much larger inside than it should have been. It looked like it went on forever, like a tunnel or corridor that extended far beyond what should have been possible. I watched for about an hour as more and more vehicles arrived and more people walked into room 21. None of them ever came back out. They just disappeared into that impossible space. Around 4:30 a.m., the activity started to slow down. Fewer vehicles were arriving, and the people who were already there began to fade away, becoming more and more transparent until they disappeared entirely. By 5 a.m., the parking lot was empty except for the 2 cars that had been there when I arrived. I went back to the window and looked toward the end of the building. Room 21 was gone. The building ended at room 20, just as it had when I checked in. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the bed, fully dressed, waiting for sunrise. As soon as there was light in the sky, I packed my things and went to the office to check out. The same elderly clerk was behind the counter, reading a different paperback novel. "How was your stay?" he asked, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Fine," I said, not wanting to get into it. "But I have to ask, what was that about not going outside after 3 a.m.? He looked up at me with a knowing expression. "You looked, didn't you? I saw things, people, cars. What was that?" He closed his book and leaned forward. "This motel sits on what you might call a crossroads, not just of highways, but of time. Every night between 3 a.m. and sunrise, travelers from different eras stop here on their way to somewhere else. Somewhere else. The next world, I suppose. The afterlife, whatever you want to call it. They're souls who died on the highways, and this is one of the places they stop to rest before continuing their journey." I stared at him. "And you just work here?" "Knowing that?" He shrugged. "Someone has to. The living need a place to stay too, and most of them never see anything if they follow the rules. The dead don't bother the living as long as the living don't interfere with them. What would happen if someone went outside during those hours? I don't know, and I don't want to find out. In 40 years of working here, I've never been tempted to test it. I paid for the room and left, driving away as fast as I could. But as I was pulling out of the parking lot, I noticed something that made me stop. There was a small sign by the road that I hadn't seen when I arrived. Sunset Motel, established 1962. a rest stop for all travelers. Below that, in smaller letters, some journeys take longer than others. I've tried to find the Sunset Motel again, both online and by driving the same route, but I've never been able to locate it. GPS systems show no motel at that location, and when I've asked locals about it, they've never heard of the place. But I know it exists. And I know that every night, somewhere in the Nevada desert, travelers from across the decades stop there to rest before continuing their journey to whatever comes next. If you ever find yourself driving through remote areas late at night and you see a motel that seems too good to be true, pay attention to any unusual rules the clerk might mention, because some places serve more than one kind of traveler, and some journeys don't end just because the traveler has died. And if you do stay at such a place, remember, some things are better left unseen, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The dead have their own business to attend to, and it's best to let them attend to it in peace. Some say these stories ended that night, but I still wake up thinking about the people I encountered on those dark highways. The rest stops that shouldn't exist, the motels where time moves differently, the radio stations broadcasting from beyond the grave. America's highways connect more than just cities and towns. They connect the spaces between what we know and what we fear, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. Thanks for listening through the darkness. If you made it this far, you probably understand why these stories need to be told. Drive safely out there, and remember, not every light you see on the highway leads to somewhere you want to go.